Good morning. Time now a minute after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, August 5th, 2022. Welcome to another edition of the online morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of online seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. This morning, we have a pleasure of having Govinda Tilmusina, who is the senior economist at the Development Research Group of the World Bank. Govinda is visiting Tokyo right now for an international conference on energy and kindly agreed to give this seminar to introduce the latest findings of his own research. Govinda, good morning to you. I just wanted to double check we are connecting with you.
Yeah, I'm connected. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. So title of his talk is Carbon Tax Design Architectures for Developing Countries. He will share the main findings from his forthcoming paper based on the case studies conducted in Africa and East Asia. We'll listen to Govinda for the next 40 minutes or so. After his presentation, I'll read the question that we received from our viewers. And thank you very much for sending your question in advance. Please send more questions during the seminar using online form posted on the announcement page for the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat screen of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question, asking Govinda to respond after his presentation. With that, I'd like to ask Govinda to come in to formally start his presentation. Govinda, over to you.
Thank you, Koichi. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to discuss about the research I have been doing for several years and getting some feedback from the audience. So my name is Govinda Tilmusina. I'm Senior Research Economist at the Research Department of the World Bank. I have been working in the field of climate change and energy economics over the last 25 years. Especially, I focus on carbon tax. That's the topic of my presentation today. So this is about carbon tax design architectures for developing countries. More than 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, my dissertation topic was also carbon tax for Thailand. Since then, I have been working in many countries around the world, developed computable general equilibrium models to analyze different policies and climate change, including carbon pricing, carbon tax, and ETS. So today I will share finding of some of my recent studies for China and some countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, and Cote d'Ivoire, as well as my review study, which is being published by the Journal of Economic Literature. Kyuchi, next slide, please. So what I'll do today, I briefly introduce about the carbon tax. Then I'll go deep into the design perspective from different angles. What is the design criteria from the economic perspective? What are the design architecture from distributional perspective? So if the objective is CO2 mitigation, then how carbon tax be designed? What should be the rate of carbon tax, whether it should be flat or increasing? Then what are the other co-benefits from the carbon tax? We are talking about local environmental benefits, and there are some other benefits from the fiscal side. And finally, I'll make some conclusions. Next slide, please. So this is my own view based on my research. This does not represent the view of the World Bank. And I use several papers, but one paper, which is on Ethiopia, is completed but hasn't published it. So the results on that case are preliminary. Next slide, please. So what is a carbon tax and how does it work? Carbon tax is basically a levy imposed on sources of CO2 in proportional to their carbon intensity, following the polluter pay principle. So what does it mean? That means it is a taxes on fossil fuels in proportional to CO2 for the same amount of energy that fuel produces, or it can be taxes on outputs in proportional to their CO2 intensity for the same amount of monetary value from that output. How does it work? There are many channels that carbon tax work. The first one, fuel price channel. A carbon tax increase the price of fuel. That means you reduce the demand of the fuel and associated emission will be reduced. The fuel substitution channel. So when the demand of energy services does not change or does not go down, so in that case, what happens is that fossil fuels are replaced, or more carbon intensive fuel are replaced with less carbon intensive fuels. Then product price channel. Sectors which are energy intensive, so the commodity produced from those sectors goes up when carbon tax is imposed. Product substitutions. In that case, the more carbon intensive sectors or outputs are substituted by the less carbon intensive sectors. For example, substitution of manufacturing sectors with the service sector. Then behavior change. So it's basically energy conservation because there is a lot of wasteful energy we are using. And so if we change our behavior and conserve some energy without sacrificing the energy services, it's energy and energy services, then we can reduce the fossil fuel demand and the CO2 emissions. And technological improvement. So basically it is the low emission technologies throughout the energy chain. It could be production where more efficient technology can be used to produce electricity, or it could be in the induced consumption. So we are using more efficient light bulb than the inefficient one to reduce the electricity demand and the associated CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. So how much do you know about carbon tax? It looks sometimes that carbon tax is a new concept, but it is not. So the concept has been developed, it was developed more than 100 years ago by English economist Arthur Pigou in 1920. So it's 2022. So he basically suggests that polluters should pay the environmental damage they cause. So that's why we are talking about carbon tax. However, the carbon tax become known to us in late 70s, when William Nordhaus, who got a Nobel Prize on climate and economics a few years back, so he started the old carbon tax in his paper in 1977. Then carbon tax took attention to researchers only after 1990, when the International Initiative on Climate Change started with the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, in 1992, IPCC in 1988. Since then, hundreds of studies have been carried out covering various issues on carbon tax. These issues include economic impact of carbon tax, distributional effects of carbon tax, how to recycle the carbon tax revenues, how does carbon tax impact competitiveness of an economy, and recently there is a much more discussion about the carbon border adjustment mechanism that EU is going to implement. I have one working paper covering all these issues and published in 2018, where is the carbon tax after 30 years of research. And after this publication, the Journal of Economic Literature is publishing my article titled Carbon Taxes, which is coming maybe within a few months. Next slide, please. So why we are talking about carbon pricing or carbon tax for developing countries? There might be an argument, well, carbon tax is regressive, it is a tax, it costs to the consumers, and developing countries are not that responsible for the CO2 emission or CO2 concentration of today, then why we are imposing carbon tax, to developing countries? Let me highlight some background or the context. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was established in 1992, so the ultimate objective was to stabilize the atmospheric concentration of GHG at a level that avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. But a very important phrase was coined there, which is common but differential responsibility. This is the common problem, but there is a different responsibility because the historical responsibility. Developed countries are more responsible because of their historical emission for the present concentration of the CO2 emissions. In the Kyoto Protocol in Japan here in 1997, which was the third conference of party to the UNFCCC, so a binding obligation was established for developed countries and economies in transition. In overall, the target was 5% reduction of CO2 emission during 2008 to 2012 from their 1990 levels. 177 countries ratified it. Then in Doha in Qatar, the Kyoto Protocol was extended to 2020 with the target of achieving 18% emission reducing during 2013 and to from the 1990 level. As most of you know, these target were not materialized, so were not met. For various reasons, I might need another webinar to discuss, why, these targets were not met. So there is a long history of the climate negotiation, and so what is happening that maybe I can elaborate in the next slide, please. So what is happening right now is that, well, the developed countries are mostly responsible to the today's concentration of the CO2 emission or GHG emissions. However, even if we eliminate all the emission coming from those countries alone, the problem of climate change will not be avoided. Climate change will happen. Why? Because the emission from developing countries, particularly from China, India, the emerging economies, are increasing rapidly. We can see in the graph in the left-hand side, the emission in CO2 emission in China, which was less than 4 gigaton per ton of CO2 in 2000, now hitting 12 gigaton per ton of CO2, 3 times higher. In India, it is also gradually increasing. On the other hand, the advanced economics, US, European Union, and Japan, they are stabilized and reducing. So that means the developing country must participate if the objective of the UNFCCC is to avoid the dangerous interference of the GHG emission in the atmosphere. That means to achieve the ultimate objective of the UNFCCC, so a developing country must participate. Next slide, please. So based on that, so in 2015, then we have a Paris Climate Agreement. The difference between this agreement and the previous agreement was, previous was kind of the, it's a mandatory obligation, but here it's, so it's an international negotiation since the Kyoto and then the countries agreed that let's have a voluntary agreement and giving some peer pressure. But in this case, what is decided that let the countries decide how much they can contribute to reduce their emission. That's why it is called nationally determined contributions. So many countries, more than 100, almost 190 countries, now they have already not only announced, but also started to adopt their nationally determined contributions. Some countries, they say, for example, small island states, they are saying that we'll have 100% renewables, these are zero emissions by 2030. Well, these are the pledges, not necessarily they can be fulfilled, but at least there is intention. So in this NDC, a carbon prices is included is one of the instrument, one of the policy instrument in many developing countries. So that's why we are talking about carbon tax today for developing countries. Next slide, please. So here I'm giving the broader picture of the climate policies. The climate policies, climate mitigation policies, can be divided in the three types. The first one is dedicated public investment, where the government or the public corporation, so they can directly invest on cleaner technologies, greenhouse gas mitigation activities. For example, state electricity utility can develop renewable electricity plants. Or the government, the municipal corporation, so they develop the low emission public transportation. The second one is the regulatory policies, where government set a regulation and asks the emitter to follow the regulation and reduce the emission. For example, renewable energy targets, renewable energy portfolio standards, energy efficiency standards. The third category is the pricing instrument. Here comes the carbon tax. There is also emission trading schemes, and there is also carbon crediting mechanism like a CDM during the Kyoto time. So this is where we have a carbon tax. Let's go to the next slide. So where is the carbon tax in terms of actual implementation? So this graph shows that this is not only carbon tax, it's a carbon pricing, which includes both carbon tax and the emission trading scheme. We can see several countries, they have implemented this carbon pricing instrument, although not that many countries in developing countries. I can see in South Africa, so we have a carbon tax, and there is some interest from different developing countries like Morocco and some other countries. So they are interested to discuss about the carbon tax, and hopefully they will implement, and that is talk about in Pakistan, even in Indonesia and some other countries. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, going forward here, so I'll discuss focusing more on the carbon tax, and these are the two studies already published as a World Bank policy research working paper. One study for China, which recently published economic impacts of meeting China's NDC through carbon taxes with alternative scheme for revenue recycling tax revenues. So this paper is available publicly, you can download. The other paper is about Côte d'Ivoire, where carbon tax in an informal economy, computable CGE models. So both studies, we use the computable general equilibrium model. And the third study is for Ethiopia, which is carbon tax with alternative tax revenue schemes. But this paper hasn't published it. So I'm going to publish, complete it and publish maybe within a couple of months. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in China, what we are doing is that what happens, what is the economic impacts having a national CO2 standard first, and then carbon tax with alternative revenue recycling schemes to meet China's NDC in 2030. If you recall, China's updated NDC is to reduce its emission intensity, which is emission divided by GDP, 65% below its 2005 level. The second study is about Côte d'Ivoire, where we use a $20 per ton of CO2 carbon tax with an explicit representation of the informal sectors, informal production activities. This is something, very new study, in a way that we don't have that many studies, separating formal and informal sector and trying to understand what is the impact of carbon tax to an informal economy. The third study, so we use the $20 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, but multiple households, because focus here is to understand the distributional impact of carbon tax in developing countries like Ethiopia. In all models, we use the CGE, which is a computable general equilibrium modeling framework. And I also supplement, these studies with my forthcoming review paper on carbon taxes being published by the Journal of Economic literature, which is a very prestigious journal. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now let's go to the question by question. So I'm talking about first designing a carbon tax from an economic efficiency perspective. So if the objective is to minimize the economic loss, I mean the loss in GDP, or if there is a loss in GDP due to the carbon tax, or maximize the economic impact if there is a positive impact on GDP because of the carbon tax. So let's go to the other slide. So here we have a case. So in China, what we're talking about, we are talking about a carbon tax to meet 65% of its emission intensity reduction in 2030 at the below 2005 level. So what we consider on the left hand side, first we consider that let's allow the China to meet its NDC having a national CO2 standards. Okay, we have to reduce. We have to meet 65% target, no matter how we are going to reduce, and whether there is a different policies, energy efficiency, renewable energy, the ETS for the power sectors, and so on. But anyway, whatever you do, we have to meet the target, right? In this, the second case, then we have a carbon tax. But under the carbon tax, we have a multiple design architecture. So in one, we use the revenue to promote wind and solar. In the third one, the government used the revenue for public consumption and public expenditure. The fourth one, the revenue are given to the household as a cash transfer. The fifth one, the carbon tax revenues is used to reduce corporate income tax. And the other one is here also, the carbon tax to reduce the capital tax. So these are the percentage change in GDP compared to 2030 baseline. You can see here, if we follow whatever China is doing right now, I mean the standards, that means meeting NDC will cause about 1% of GDP loss. And China's GDP 1% is a really very high number in absolute term. But if carbon tax is used instead of the standards, we can see there's a significant reduction on this economic cost. In one of the case where carbon tax revenue is used to cut capital tax, so the GDP reduction is about 8 times lower compared to the case of standards. There are two interesting messages from these slides. First, carbon tax is economically efficient instrument no matter how the revenues are recycled. Second, even within the carbon tax, some schemes are much more efficient than the others. For example, using the carbon tax to cut the capital tax is much more efficient compared to a carbon tax giving the tax revenue to wind and solar. So it shows that that's why it is very important how economic carbon tax depends on how the revenues are recycled to the economy. Next slide, please. So the other question that should fossil energy sectors be excluded from revenue recycling? So this is the case from the Côte d'Ivoire. So these are the two cases, production tax cut case and the labor tax cut case. The interesting finding here is that if fossil fuels are also given the tax rebate, the carbon tax revenue also given to the fossil fuel, in production tax cut case, there is a GDP loss. But if the fossil fuel are excluded, there will be positive impact on GDP. Similar thing happened in the labor tax cut case. Although in both cases, there is an increase in GDP, but the GDP increase would be high if the revenue are not given to the fossil fuel sector. The reason is that our objective is to meet the CO2 emissions. If we give the revenue to the fossil fuel, it will have a rebound effect. They will also increase the emissions. So that's why it's very important, fossil fuel sector be excluded from the carbon tax benefits. Next slide, please. do that. So now in the last slide, we said that it depends, the economic performance of carbon tax depends on where the revenue is recycled. Here we are talking how the revenue is recycled, not where, but also it's important how. This is the case of giving revenue to reduce corporate tax, but again, how we recycle to reduce the corporate tax matters. For example, in the case, if we give this revenue based on the CO2 intensity, that means a sector that has a higher CO2 get less carbon tax revenue. So it has the highest GDP loss, 0.82. If the revenue is given to the different sectors based on their corporate tax rate, it will be slightly lower. On the other hand, if the revenue is given to the different sector based on how much they export their product, so there is a highest benefit. That means the GDP loss is the lowest. So that means it's not only where the carbon tax revenue is recycled, but it's also important how it is recycled. Next slide. Now let's go to the distributional impact. So I'll show the case from Ethiopia. So what happened in the different revenue recycling scheme on the distributional impact. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So here we have different cases. So first we have a different household, the Q1 to Q5, 5 quintile. Q1 means the poorest household, and the Q5 is the highest household. And then we have different use of carbon tax. For example, government use, cash to household, labor tax cut, capital tax cut, investment, and corporate tax cut. We can see in most of the cases, what is happening is that this is the impact on the household. The high income household are more benefiting. We can see the income is higher in the high household, and the low income household are getting less benefit. So that means the carbon tax is regressive. So it impacts whether if it's a negative impact, it impacts more on the low income household. If it's a positive impact, so it gives the more benefit to the high income household. So now the regressivity of the carbon tax is a big challenge for the policymaker, basically politician, because nobody wants this type of design scheme. Then we have to change it. So how to change it? Let's go to the next slide. So here we have three options. In one option, let's give the revenue. So for those households based on their income, that means in this case, the household which are paying more income tax, they are getting more revenue. That means that the high income household are getting higher revenue. In the second case, it's equal. So that means every household gets the equal revenue as a rebate. And the third one is reverse income. That means the poorest household gets the highest. So who has the poorest income, so it gets the highest revenue, carbon tax revenue. See the trend. So in the last two cases, the equal and the reverse income, the low income household has a high household income compared to the high income household. That means in this case now, the design is progressive. The carbon tax benefits more to the poor than the rich. Next slide, please. Yeah, so since, so we don't have that much time, so I'm going a little bit quickly here. So the next objective is CO2 reduction. Obviously carbon tax objective is the CO2 reduction. However, we are talking about developing country. That's why the focus is not only the CO2 mitigation. The focus should be, other aspect, the distributional aspect, the economic efficiency aspect, and all. But what happened? So how to design the carbon tax if the objective is to reduce the CO2 emissions? Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So here, So do emission reduction from a carbon tax change under different revenue recycling schemes? So we have a one carbon tax. This is the case of Ethiopia, where we are talking about $20 per ton of CO2, but see the impact on emissions. So there's a highest reduction of emissions when the tax revenue is given to the household as a cash transfer, whether it's whatever criteria we use, and the CO2 emission impact will be lowest. That means there is a less reduction of CO2 emission when the revenue, the tax revenue is used to cut the corporate tax cut. Now see the contradiction between the economic efficiency objective and the environmental objective. If we recall, the economic the loss, the GDP loss, was lowest when the tax revenue was used to cut corporate tax. That was the best tax design architecture if the objective is economic efficiency. But it's just opposite here. If the objective is CO2 reduction, then that criteria does not work because it will cause the lowest reduction of CO2 emissions. So that's why these objectives are contradicting each other, and on the big policy question here. So how to design, how to mix the design so that the different objectives can be fulfilled. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So here again, I talk about in the economic efficiency, if the objective is to reduce the CO2 emission, then the fossil fuel sector or thermal power generation should not get any incentive from the carbon tax revenue. So if we give, then what happened? The emission reduction reduces significantly. I mean, there will be less emission reduction. For example, in Cote d'Ivoire, if we give the tax revenue to the fossil fuel also, so emission reduction decreases by half, from 9.65 to 4.28 in the case of production tax cut. The similar thing happens in the case of labor tax cut. That means if our objective is to reduce the CO2 emission, the fossil fuel sectors, including thermal power generation, should not get any benefit from the carbon tax revenue. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here also another very interesting result is that although the emission reduction target is the same, this is the case from China, where we are talking about carbon tax to reduce emissions. The carbon tax, the emission reduction here is about 10.5% reduction from the baseline in 2030, but the carbon tax required to hit the same target, same emission reduction, are significantly different. For example, if the tax revenue is used to promote wind and solar, then there is a additional reduction because of the wind and solar. That's why we need a lowest carbon tax, $16.1 per ton of CO2. On the other hand, if we give the tax to the corporate income and the reduction of the corporate income tax, then the tax rate would be the higher. Again, the interesting is that there is no linear relationship. What happens is that although these tax rates are higher in the corporate income tax reduction case, the economic impact, the GDP loss, was the lowest. So that's why it doesn't mean that the higher carbon tax would have a higher impact on the economy. That's not the case. The relationship is nonlinear. So normally that is the perception, but that is not the case, from the research. Let's go to the next slide. So now, what should be the rate of carbon tax? The economic theory suggests the optimal carbon tax is that which equalizes the marginal cost of abatement with the marginal damage, which is social cost of carbon. For 1.5 degree target, there is a study, DICE 2018, is talking about $85 per ton of CO2 in 2020, then 145 CO2 in 2030, then very high price in 2100. These are all in 2000 prices. Nordhaus, so he used the SCC, the social cost of carbon concept. It comes about $13 per ton of CO2 in 2015 price, and $103 per ton of CO2 in 2050. The report of high-level commission on carbon prices, Joe Stiglitz, so the study suggests that $50 to $100 per ton of CO2 tax by 2030 to achieve the 2-degree target. I mean, it's a 2030, but later on it will be higher. Ian Perry from IMF, he calculates about $35 per ton of CO2, which is 2017 price, to achieve the NDC target of the large emitters. So let's go to the next slide. So these are the carbon tax rate in the different countries. Some countries, they have very nominal carbon tax rate, like Poland, so Kazakhstan. But some countries like, Scandinavian countries and Uruguay, they have very high cost of carbon, more than $130 per ton of CO2. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so should the real rate of carbon tax be flat or increasing? Based on a study for China, so we did a study for China, a gradually increasing rate would be efficient. It will cause low economic cost. Then a flat rate to meet the same target. For example, to meet China's NDC, which is 65% reduction from the 2005 level, a carbon tax introduced at about 10 UN per ton of CO2 in 2015 and increased to about 157 per ton of CO2 in 2030. It reduces GDP by 0.4%. But for the same target, if the rate is flat, it causes 0.5% of GDP loss. That means the gradually increasing rate is better. Based on a study for US, a fixed rate, 43 to 45 ton of CO2, introduced in 2019 would be enough to reduce CO2 emission 28% 2005 below its 2005 level. Chang and Hofstede. In the case of fixed rate, duration matters. If the duration decreases by 2 years, carbon tax starts in 2021 instead of 2019. In Chang and Hofstede case, the tax rate increases by 9%. That means they have a less amount of time to have adjustment in the economy. If the duration decreases by 4 years, then the tax increases by 23% to achieve the same reduction level. Next, please, next slide. So what are the environmental benefits of the carbon tax? The main environmental benefits are reduction of the local air pollution. Lee et al. Show that $72 per ton of CO2 carbon tax that reduces 24% of CO2 emissions in China by 2030 also reduces 25% of SOx emissions and 19% of PM, 19% of the NOx reduction and 12% of the reduction of the PM would avoid 94,000 premature deaths at 3.7 times larger than the cost of carbon tax. What does it mean? So carbon tax is beneficial even if we do not account the climate change mitigation benefit. The health benefit, the local air pollution benefit are alone enough to justify a carbon tax. Reallocate et al. 2018 show that $25 per ton of CO2 carbon tax introduced in 2020 and increased 5% annually until 2040 would produce 71 to 162 billion of health benefits by reducing PM 2.5. Similar cases are reported in other countries, and empirically shows that carbon tax, local benefits of the carbon tax would be highest in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, China, and Poland, which are more emission-intensive countries. Next slide, please. So, does the carbon tax reduce economic informality? This is the question, so that we try to understand in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, where the economy is basically informal, and there is a huge evasion of the tax. For example, the official rate of VAT, value-added tax, is 19%. but the effective rate is only 4%. That means there's a huge evasion of tax. Then the good thing about carbon tax is that carbon tax is not easy to evade because this is the upstream tax. Once it's placed on the fuel, everybody who is buying the fuel, they have to pay the carbon tax. So there is no room to cheat like in the VAT in the case of carbon tax. That's why there's a benefit of avoiding tax evasion. Similarly, there is also, if the carbon tax revenues are recycled to the formal sector, it might give some incentive to the informal sector to move towards the formal sectors. For example, here we have four cases. In the first case, we give the cash to every household. When we say household, it's difficult to distinguish between the formal and informal, and all households get the benefits. In the second case, we use the carbon tax to reduce the production tax cut. We can see here that basically the economic, the GDP increases, the tax, which is the output, increases by 0.46% of the formal sector. The output decreases of the informal sector. So what does it mean? The output shifting from informal to the formal sector. But that doesn't happen if the tax revenue is given to household as a cash transfer. That also doesn't happen if it is used, to cut the VAT, because we also cannot distinguish, who is paying the VAT, formal and informal sector. But where we can distinguish between the formal and informal sector, so there is a clear benefit of providing incentive to the formal sector to encourage or to motivate the informal sector to move towards the formal sector. Next slide, please. Yeah. So also, that is also the, some incentive for the labor mobility. Again, in the case of production tax cut and the labor tax cut, especially in the labor tax cut, because, the formal sector basically they use this tax revenue to cut their labor tax. So in that case, there is a clear informal labor to move the formal sectors. Next slide, please, and which is my last slide, I guess. Okay, now conclusion, can a carbon tax be appropriate for developing countries? Based on these a series of studies, it is a conditional. It can be if the carbon tax is designed in a way it benefits the country even without accounting the co-benefits. For example, Cote d'Ivoire, where the carbon tax increases the GDP that we saw from our analysis. If the economic cost of carbon tax is smaller than that in other policies to achieve the same mitigation target, for example, China, because in carbon tax case, the economic costs are even 6 to 8 times lower than the standards, the emission standards. Third, if health and environmental benefits of a carbon tax offset the tax of the local air pollution is high, it's like this, for example, if the health and environmental benefit itself can justify the carbon tax, for example, in the case of China, where the local benefits is 3 times higher than the cost of carbon tax itself. In some cases, for example, like in Nepal, the reduction of other emission, for example, SOx and NOx, is almost equal or even higher than the reduction of CO2. So that means even without accounting the benefit from the carbon tax, we can justify the carbon tax from the local environmental benefits. And help reduce the economic informality and the leakage of existing taxes. That is, we found in the case of Cote d'Ivoire. And the most important is that because carbon tax is very sensitive politically, and general public are also electing to the carbon tax, the distributional perspective is very important. If the carbon tax is designed in a way that it helps the poor, so in that case it can be justified politically, and maybe there's a less resistance from the general public. This I like to close my presentation. The next 2 slides, so I have provided all the references. So I have my coordinates contact point. In case you need to contact me, please do so. So with this, I like stop here, and I'll welcome any question you might have.
Thank you very much, Govinda, for your keynote presentation. I know the original presentation that you prepared was much longer, but thank you very much for squeezing it for the shorter version. We were able to listen to your bigger picture story in much concise manner. So we received several questions from our audience. So let me read those questions, asking you to respond. First question, how do you move your analysis and proposals to policy actions by the developing countries themselves and international society in order to introduce a relevant carbon tax scheme in developing countries? Govinda, please come in and respond. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting questions, and this is a very standard question also, because normally we do a lot of research, but the research doesn't have any value unless it doesn't change into actual policies. So what is happening in the bank is that, so we do some research, and we also use research done by others, but we have a very huge carbon finance unit. So more than so hundreds of staff there. They go to the developing countries. They try to inform to the policymaker, the ministers, and the other policymakers. So how the carbon tax work, whether carbon tax will be beneficial or not. So those are the so bank staff, and there is also a regular dialogue between the international communities, the development partners. So how can carbon tax would be beneficial for the developing countries? So that's going on. It's a continuous process. There are many, for example, this high-level working committee on carbon pricing also led by the World Bank. So that facilitates the discussion, the dialogue at the international level, and also our staff working on the operational wing of the bank. So they go to the countries, talk to the policymakers, and also inform them the findings coming from the research that we have done, and so inform them that how carbon tax could be useful to them. So I have been personally involved in some countries. For example, I'm working in Morocco, where the government is interested to see how carbon tax would be helpful for them. So we are working, developing CGE model, and also informing the ministry. So that is happening in many countries, and that's how the finding from the research like this is actually communicated. It's communicated to the policymaker. We don't insist, because this is the country. Whether they might like it, they might not like it, but our role is to inform them, and if they like it, they implement. Thank you.
Thank you for your responses. Let me read a second question that we received in advance. The slide says that equal and reverse order recycling, low-income household receives higher rebate, are progressive. To design the optimal rebate for reverse order, what is the critical and criteria and the formulas to be used? Is the equal here meaning equity?
Yeah. So when equal means, so we know the number of the household in a particular country, and whatever carbon tax comes, so we give equally to all the household. The benefit here is that the poor household also get the same amount of money, compared to the rich household. That means if we talk about the total, household income, the percentage of carbon tax revenue in their total household income would be higher, because they have a total income is lower compared to the rich household. In that case, the poor household will get the more tax revenue. In the reverse order, what we did is that, so basically, if my income is the lowest, I get the highest income. It's just the opposite, inverse of the household income. So that is the criteria we recycle to the tax revenue in the case of the reverse order case.
Thank you for your responses. Let me continue with the questions. The slide says a carbon tax can provide incentives to labor force to move from informal production activities to formal production activities when carbon tax revenue is recycled to cut labor tax in the formal sector. The informal sector tends to be chosen by the poorer and the people who have other difficulties to enter the formal sector. Then, if the carbon tax revenue gives preferential treatment, to the formal sector without the other policies that remove such barriers, I'm worried if it would lead to regressive. Any plans or suggestions, please?
Yeah, a very good question. And this is a very practical question. Sometimes, what we come up with some theoretical model, not necessarily, can be implemented in practice. And in that context, this question is very important. But there is some solution also. For example, if the carbon tax revenue, goes to a government fund, and if the government fund can be used to facilitate the informal sector to move the formal sector, so in that case, the carbon tax purely help the informal sector. So it reduces the barriers to move the formal sector. So that could be one solution. We can think about many other solutions, but that's what came to my mind right now.
Thank you very much. Let me add the one question from my side. The World Bank, we tend to work very closely with the national government. But on the other hand, I'm sure there must be roles and space for the local government or cities in general. In fact, you are now in Tokyo. You are going to visit Kyoto later today. How do you comment in terms of the role of the local government or cities? And then whether experiences accumulated in the cities or local government in developed countries or advanced countries like Japan or US would be helpful to their counterparts in the developing countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I'll give you an example. Although there is no carbon tax or no emission trading at the national level in Japan, but there is a carbon tax and ETS in Tokyo, so at the city level. In China, before China started this national emission trading scheme for electricity sector, they did a pilot project in 7 big cities, including Shanghai and Beijing and other 5 cities. So the cities, they have a relatively big economy compared to the other geography in a country, and they have also resources. It is also possible, politically, it might not be feasible to have a carbon pricing, whether it's a carbon tax or ETS at the national level, but city can move ahead. They can use their resources and can implement some of the scheme. So where that scheme can promote, carbon pricing. And the experience coming from the developed cities like Tokyo or Shanghai can be implemented in developing countries. So, and also the experience can be used to enable the activities in developing countries through the knowledge transfer, through the experience transfer. So there is a big role, the cities can play in the developed countries, to to inform to the developing countries, cities, how some pricing policy can be beneficial to the city level and also at the national level.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we wrap up our seminar and let you go and catch your bullet train to Kyoto, please, Govinda, give us your final thoughts, final remarks that you would like to share with the audience in Japan.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank you again, for organizing this seminar in a very short interval of time. And this is a great opportunity for me to share, some of the finding, empirical and numerical finding coming from the rigorous studies to the audience. So this is very important because the most important is the right information, is a more, objective information. That is very helpful for the policymakers, and we should continue doing this type of exercise. Not only doing this exercise, also communicating this exercise to the various stakeholders, through the platform what you provided today. So very, very important. And so I wish you will have a similar opportunity in future, to give this type of platform, for other researchers to communicate. This is a environmental related issues. Thank you very much. And thank you all the audience for your passion to listen to me, no matter where you are located right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a pleasure of having Govinda Timilsina, the senior economist at the Development Research Group of the World Bank, with us, actually joining during his stay in Tokyo. Govinda, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Great, thank you
Have
very
a
much.
nice day.
Thank you. So this concludes the first half of 2022 online morning seminars. In fact, we had 17 online morning seminars during this period. We will be taking a quick summer break and we'll be back in a few weeks. Please check our website, the World Bank Tokyo office website, for the updated information on the forthcoming activities. With that, once again, thank you very much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next time. Thank you very much.